The Bourne Identity. Written, directed and performed in 13 episodes by Jesse Rowe.
Chapter 2. The Apartment.
That night Sarah awoke with a start. The room was pitch black. She switched on her bedside lamp, but it flickered and died, plunging the room back into darkness. She listened intently, straining to hear any unusual sounds. There it was again. A faint scratching noise coming from the corridor by the front door. Sarah crept out of bed, moving silently towards the noise. She saw the beams of torchlight dancing under the door. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow, and peeking through the peephole, outside stood Dr. Marsh. Her face set in a grim expression. She was flanked by 3 men, all dressed in black, with scarves covering their faces. They held stun batons, electricity crackling ominously between the prongs. Sarah's heart raced. She recognized the doctor's determined gaze and knew they were in grave danger. She crawled back to the bedroom and shook Robert awake. "We have to go now?" Robert, instantly alert, grabbed their baby, still swaddled in the blue blanket. They moved to the window, knowing escape through the front door was now impossible. The apartment was on the 8th floor, but there was no other choice. They climbed out onto the windowsill, the baby secure in a sling against Sarah's chest. The night was pitch black, the city lights obscured by heavy clouds. They began their descent, gripping the balconies and ledges with desperate determination. As they reached the 5th floor, Sarah looked up and saw a man in a balaclava peer over their balcony, pointing directly at them. Another man joined him, followed by Dr. Marsh, who shouted orders they could not hear. Panic surged through Sarah as 2 men started climbing down after them, moving with frightening agility. We have to move faster, she whispered urgently to Robert. They quickened their pace, but the pursuers were gaining ground. Sarah's muscles burned with effort, the baby's weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. They reached the 3rd floor, and Sarah glanced up again. The men were dangerously close, their dark figures looming. "Almost there," Robert panted, his voice strained. With one effort, they reached the ground, landing heavily but safely. Without pausing, they sprinted into the darkness, the sounds of their pursuers echoing behind them. They did not stop running until they found refuge in an old abandoned warehouse. Huddled together, Sarah and Robert held their baby close, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They knew their lives would now never be the same. The doctor's pursuit had exposed them to a world of danger that they had never imagined, but they were resolved to protect their child at any cost. Any cost? As dawn approached, they formulated a plan to disappear, to start anew somewhere far away from Dr. Marsh and her sinister intentions. They knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the sake of the baby they held in their arms, they would have to face the challenges that lay ahead. They walked for 3 hours, every step laden with exhaustion and anxiety. The dense foliage of the English Cotswolds countryside offered a sanctuary, albeit a temporary one. Underneath a large laurel bush, they found an uneasy rest. The rain fell relentlessly, soaking through their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Despite their fatigue, sleep was fitful, haunted by the looming threat of discovery. In the grey light of dawn, they roused themselves and continued their trek, the wet earth squelching beneath their feet. They moved with cautious urgency, following canal paths and traversing fields, steering clear of cities covered by the view of CCTV cameras. The thought of Dr. Marsh might have accessed those surveillance systems haunted them. If she was as dangerous as they feared, could she be watching their every move? How important was their baby to this doctor? As morning gave way to afternoon, they scavenged for food, relying on the bins outside country pubs. The sun dipped below the horizon and the cold night air set in. They found a temporary refuge behind a pub, where Robert peered through a frosted window, desperate for a moment of normalcy. The hours had weighed heavy on them, and the muted glow of a television inside showed a football match, a fleeting reminder of the world that they had now left behind. He wiped a small patch of the glass with his sleeve, but the image remained obscured. Frustrated, he leaned closer, trying to make out the team names. A blue team clashed with a red one, but the specifics eluded him. Suddenly the match was interrupted. The screen flashed a breaking news banner, and Robert's pulse quickened. He strained to hear, but the glass muffled the sound. Then his heart nearly stopped as he saw the faces, his face and his wife's face, appear on the screen. It contained a grainy CCTV image, taken from a crossroads by the canal. Dr. Marsh had indeed harnessed the power of surveillance, even in the most remote of areas. Panic surged through him. He turned to Sarah, his face pale. "They're looking for us," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What is it?" she asked, moving closer. Robert squeezed her hand, his eyes wide with fear. "They've put out the bounty. They're calling us fugitives, killers. There's a reward for us, dead or alive." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wiped the window frantically to get a clearer view, but the squeak drew attention from the man inside the pub. His gaze locked on to them, then flickered at the TV and back again. Recognition dawned on his face, and he pointed, shouting to the others. "Run!" Robert urged, pulling Sarah along as they dashed into the night. A chorus of shouts and the sound of running feet followed them. They sprinted into the pub's car park, where a drunken man was fumbling with his car keys. Robert didn't hesitate. He shoved the man aside, grabbed the keys and opened the passenger door for Sarah, and sped away. The car fishtailed on the wet tarmac as Robert fought to control it. Ahead, in the beam of their headlights, a figure appeared. Dr. Marsh stood in the middle of the road, her face calm and composed. Before Robert could react, she raised a revolver and fired! The first shot cracked the windshield, the second pierced the hood, and the third went wide. Robert swerving to avoid her, but the car veered off the road, crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. Dazed, Robert scrambled out, clutching the baby protectively. Blood trickled from the cut on his forehead, mingling in the rain. Dr. Marsh walked calmly towards them, her revolver raised. She fired again, and Robert felt the searing pain in his shoulder. He stumbled into the bushes, blood pouring, the baby's cries echoing in his ears. From his hiding spot, Robert watched as Dr. Marsh slowly walked towards the wrecked car. But when she was still 10 meters from it, Dr. Marsh's eyes turned to the trees where she had seen the father and baby flee, and then back to the shadowy car before her. She knew the mother was inside, concealed by the thick darkness. Each step she took towards the car felt heavy with purpose, the night around her unnaturally still, amplifying the pounding of her heart. She approached the vehicle, the beams from the headlights of an approaching vehicle slicing through the gloom, casting fleeting, eerie shadows. She could see nothing through the windows, their blackness impenetrable. The uncertainty gnawed at her. Inside, the mother waited, hidden, perhaps bracing for what was to come. Dr. Marsh's grip on the gun tightened, her breath steadying as she raised it, her senses honing in on the crushed car in front of her. Every fibre of her being focused on the task. She aimed, the barrel of the gun cold and unwavering in her hand, and fired. For a split second, the muzzle flash caused by superheated gases exiting the gun behind the bullet radiated its energy to the surroundings as visible light. It exploded in a brilliant burst, illuminating the inside of the car in stark, fleeting detail. In that brief moment, her eyes strained to capture any sign of movement, any hint of impact. But just as quickly, the darkness swallowed the scene again, leaving her in a vacuum of silence. She stood motionless, her breath caught in her throat, ears straining for any sound from within the car. The seconds dragged on, each one a torturous stretch of uncertainty. Had she missed? Had the bullet found its mark? The oppressive silence was broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the faint hum of a vehicle behind her, as Dr. Marsh remained frozen, waiting for a sign, any sign that her shot had hit its target. She crouched down to look, but could see nothing inside. Standing up, she aimed the gun into the air and fired. "I'm going to get you, little boy, one way or another," Dr. Marsh shouted, her voice cold and determined. She aimed at the bushes and pulled the trigger, but the gun clicked empty. 6. 6. 6 shots she had fired. She paused. She counted. 3 at the car, 1 at the man as he crawled away, 1 to finish the woman, and 1 in the air. 6. She didn't even expect to use them all. In her excitement and passion, she got carried away. She must learn to control her anger, she thought. She brushed the loose strand of hair, fallen from her auburn chic bob-cut style. Frustrated, she turned as a van pulled up behind her. The sliding door opened and 3 men in black jumped out. She pointed towards the bushes, and they ran in pursuit. Dr. Marsh climbed into the driver's seat of the van and put her head on the steering wheel. She stayed like that for a moment, her shoulders shaking. Tears began to drip from her eyes and drop onto her suit trousers. She snivelled, and then she lifted her head and looked around. She didn't want her men to see her emotional side. No. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and wiggled her nose, and then her face changed into a mask of determination once more. Robert watched as the men combed the area, their torchlight cutting through the darkness. He cradled the baby tightly, willing him to be silent. The men moved methodically, their low voices mingling with the rustling of leaves. Robert's heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud in his ears. Just as one of the men drew near, a branch snapped beneath him. Robert's heart skipped a beat. The man turned, shining his torchlight to the source of the noise. A deer, startled by the commotion, darted away. The man cursed under his breath and moved on. Robert took a breath, inching further into the underbrush, and was gone.